is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. One of the biggest listings in years. Trading starts in the United States for China's ride-hailing giant Didi.
Our other headlines: China is declared malaria-free after a 70-year fight to eradicate the disease. Plus,
if we don't address their needs, over the next 6 to 9 months, you could have unprecedented famine of biblical proportions.
The dire warning from the World Food Programme unless urgent action is taken to tackle global food shortages.
just hours to go before the deadline expires, the EU residents struggling to remain in the UK.
And the American journalist who witnessed the founding of the Communist Party of China 100 years ago.
It was years in the making, but trading has finally started on the New York Stock Exchange for China's ride-hailing giant Didi.
The company raised $4.4 billion during its initial public offering, exceeding expectations and making it the biggest Chinese listing in the US since Alibaba in 2014. CGTN's Weilin Tang reports.
Almost a decade ago in China, standing by the road trying to hail a cab was pretty standard. And sometimes you might not even have been able to get one. These days, though, you only need to tap your phone for a car to come and pick you up. The domestic success of Chinese ride-hailing giant Didi has changed the game. Didi started its mobility business 9 years ago, in 2012.
For now, over 90% of Didi's revenues still come from its home turf, China. Foreign markets accounted for less than 2% of its total revenues as of end March 2021. Now, in its listing prospectus, Didi said it plans to use 30% of its IPO net proceeds to grow its presence in selected international markets outside of China.
For the domestic market, because the market share in Tier 1 and 2 is already pretty high, and they have a big user base, which is an asset for them to diversify into related business, like goods delivery, two-wheelers, home moving, etc., and even food delivery. But for international markets, it's more of an expansion of their current core business, which is e-hailing.
This comes as analysts say Didi's growth in big Chinese cities has stalled. The company began expanding outside of China in 2018. Globally, it operates across 15 countries, including Brazil and Mexico.
Either from growth perspective or from competition perspective, it's necessary for them to go global, because you never know where your next competitor came from. Yeah, if you don't capture this market, it will anyway captured by someone else.
For Leo, he cites a potential regulatory crackdown as a major risk for the company. Chinese authorities have recently increased scrutiny on local technology companies when it comes to anti-monopoly practices.
On one side, they were already blamed for being manipulating the price as the market consolidates. And they have that kind of dominant position to make the price, right? And the second thing is they expanding into many related businesses, which can also be monopoly suspicion from regulatory perspective.
Leo says there are two things that Didi should do in this regard. First, make its pricing mechanism transparent. And second, be cautious in how it treats its competitors.
I think the way they've opened the platform to smaller operators is a good practice.
As a market leader, Leo says Didi has a responsibility to guarantee the health of the entire industry and sector. Weilin Tang, CGTN, Shanghai.
Live now to our correspondent John Terrett at the New York Stock Exchange. Yes. John, Didi, one of the most anticipated listings of this year. How have investors reacted so far?
Well, you know, it's a very, very funny thing because Didi is a unicorn. You know, what's a unicorn, John? A unicorn is a private company worth more than $1 billion, and I believe it's China's fourth largest unicorn. And when the unicorns come to market here, for some reason that I don't really understand, it takes them forever to actually open the stock. So the market has been going for, well, since 9:30 this morning, so that's about 2.5 hours ago, and they still haven't got round to actually opening Didi. However, my spy on the floor of the stock exchange floor, which is right next door to this building where you see me at the moment, tells me that the indicated opening price is $15.75 to $16.25, and that is better than the $14 which they agreed upon within the last 24 hours, and which they have sold an awful lot of stock to those people who have access to these things before it actually floats publicly for the first time. They've sold 10% more stock than they thought they would. They've raised $4.4 billion, you've said that. They want to make it a $100 billion company altogether once the dust settles. Now, as I say, it is the fourth largest unicorn. As things stand right at this very moment, the company is worth around $62 billion. So you can see they want to increase that by pretty much just under a half again by the time everything is done. And as you've also said, this is the second biggest Chinese IPO that we've had in New York since Alibaba went public. And that was back in 2014, so that's about 7 years ago now, and that was around $25 billion. So we are talking about much more money here, Jamie.
John, it's a complicated story, this, isn't it, given the rather tense China-United States diplomatic and economic relationship and China's growing concern about big tech monopoly at home. I wonder if it's going to be smooth sailing for Didi.
Well, you're certainly right. This is, in a way, it's all rather odd because there is a lot of anti-China sentiment in America at the moment, as you know. For example, there are companies at the stock exchange which have been delisted, the telecom companies, Mobile and Unicom, and China Telecom, stuff like that, and Americans can't deal with some pretty big Chinese corporations like the Overseas Oil Corporation and, of course, Huawei. They've been banned, and Joe Biden is much more hawkish towards China than we ever thought that he would be, and the Innovation and Competition Act, which is designed to stop China's ambitions of expanding around the world by beating it at its own game, that's working its way through the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. at the moment. But having said that, regarding Didi, I think the anti-China sentiment has been rather put on the back burner, if I could put it that way. And I think the reason for that is that Didi is not, well, I mean, it kind of is and it kind of isn't seen as a Chinese company. It's seen much more as a global operator, because as you know, it does operate in China, obviously. It operates in Australia and Japan and Latin America and Russia and all sorts of other places as well. In fact, 15 countries in total. Now, at home in China, its expansion has been slowing lately, but Didi predicts that by 2030 there'll be a huge expansion in Chinese cities generally, and that will play to its strengths. 90% of its revenue comes from China, only 2% from overseas markets. Now, what they're going to do with this IPO is take 30% of the money raised and use that to expand in select markets around the world. Now, just to round this off, ride-hailing is seen as a real growth area, particularly food delivery. But analysts also see Didi expanding into things like moving home and two-wheelers, and of course, eventually, I suppose, some kind of flying vehicle, flying car. Against the company, well, regulation. Any of the markets that they operate in could decide to regulate against tech companies. Remember, it is essentially a tech company. You know, we think of it as a car company like Uber, but it's really a technology company, and they have just short of 500 million active users. So regulation's a problem. Employing drivers in the gig economy is a potential problem. Safety for all of these companies is a problem. So those are the potential headwinds. But right now, it's yet to open. I'm still waiting for the indication that it's actually open. But right now, as of this moment, Wednesday in New York is Didi's day.
John Terretts in New York, thank you very much. Well, John mentioned their difficult weather for Chinese businesses doing business abroad, and France's largest telecoms company, Orange, says it'll avoid using equipment from Chinese vendors when developing Europe's 5G networks. But the company sees no issue in working with Huawei in Africa, where the Chinese company is the dominant supplier. The CEO, Stéphane Richard, said the company had an excellent business relationship with Huawei. He said they would use Ericsson and Nokia in Europe, however.
Let's move to China's economy now, and official data shows the pace of growth slowing in June. That's seen as evidence of a slowdown in export growth momentum because of COVID-related disruption at the country's ports. The Manufacturing Purchasing Manager Index growth slipped to 50.9 from 51 in May. Any reading above 50, though, indicates expansion.
And all that comes as China's economic recovery continues. That's according to the latest report from the World Bank. The bank says China's economic growth will come in at around about 8.5% this year, before slowing to 5.4% in 2022.
What we are seeing is that the recovery is solidifying and broadening. We see a gradual rotation from initially public investment and export-driven recovery to a more organically driven domestic private demand-driven economy with both consumption, private consumption and private investment picking up and trending towards pre-COVID levels.
Space startup OneWeb, part owned by the UK government, has been given a $500 million cash injection by India's Bharti Capital. Bharti, which alongside the UK government bought OneWeb out of bankruptcy last year, is now the biggest shareholder with a 39% stake. The new investment is set to help OneWeb launch more commercial satellites.
Staying in space, shares in Virgin Galactic have surged after the company won approval from regulators in the United States to take civilians into orbit. Richard Branson's spaceflight group has seen its stock rise over 40%, more than doubling in value this year. Virgin Galactic completed its first manned spaceflight from its base in New Mexico last month.
China has been officially declared malaria-free by the World Health Organization. It marks a 70-year effort to eradicate the infectious disease, with the number of cases in the 1940s reaching 30 million. China is only the 40th country or territory to receive the certification and is by far the most populous one. China's foreign ministry says it's an incredible achievement.
The Communist Party of China and the Chinese government have always given top priority to safeguarding people's health, life, safety and well-being, and have adopted various measures and achieved remarkable results. The average life expectancy of Chinese people has risen from 35 years in 1949 to 77.3 years. The main health indicators of the Chinese are generally better than the average level of middle and high-income countries. With improvement in women and children's right to health, China is recognized by the WHO as one of the 10 fast-track countries in women's and children's health.
The World Health Organization also offered their congratulations to China, praising the country's fight against malaria. Their director of the Global Malaria Program is Dr. Pedro Alonso. I asked him how China had managed such an achievement.
So, yes, it is a pretty extraordinary achievement, a historical date in the global fight against malaria. And China has gone from having 30 million cases of malaria every year to getting down to 0 cases, and thus technically what we would call interrupting malaria transmission. How have they done this? I would say, first of all, this was a long-term plan, a long-term decision by the Chinese people and the Chinese government 6-7 decades ago to eliminate malaria. Malaria was a major cause of disease, death, poverty. And thus they started launching campaigns that involved a whole-of-government approach. This was not just a health sector. And so a long-term vision, a sustained effort over 6-7 decades, a whole-of-government approach. Finally, if I had to highlight another really important element, is the research component. There was and there has been a sustained research culture, a problem-solving culture. And as such, China started deploying insecticide-treated bed nets 2 or 3 decades ahead of any other country in the world as a vector control form. They launched an intense effort to develop new anti-malarial medicines. And as such, artemisinin, which are now the backbone of all our treatment against malaria across the world, were developed by Chinese scientists by the way, earned them the Nobel Prize.
So China's now one of 40 countries that are certified malaria-free, but it is, of course, still a huge problem in much of the rest of the world.
Indeed. And I believe the significance of today's recognition of China is not just that it's the largest country that has eliminated malaria in terms of landmass, but also the largest and the most populated country. But a recognition of a major public health achievement by China and the people of China. But today the importance is that if a country that was a very high burden country with 30 million cases can get to zero, it means that African countries that still bear the brunt of the disease across the globe, that still have 400,000 deaths due to malaria every year, they have 200 million malaria cases every year, they too can get to zero.
So as you say, the goal, of course, to get to zero cases globally. How close are we to that, do you think?
We're not close. We have to manage expectations. Malaria is one of the biggest killers of mankind historically. Eliminating malaria, it's a long process, as China has just demonstrated. We believe that there is a path. We believe that there is light at the end of the tunnel, but this won't be a matter of 1 decade or 2 decades. We're probably talking of 3-4 decades before we can see a world free of malaria.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, global house prices boom in the pandemic. But can that continue?
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Welcome back to CGTN Live from London. Just a reminder that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app.
Two big UK property tax breaks are being reduced this week. The business rates holiday for retail, hospitality and leisure is being slashed, threatening the pace of recovery for rate-paying firms.
Meanwhile, home buyers are scrambling to complete their purchases before the government's property buying tax break deadline expires. Well, Juliet Mann is here with the details. Juliet.
Well, thanks both of you. That's right. The duty holiday for home buyers has helped people get onto the property market, but the rush has pushed up house prices. Year on year, UK house prices are growing 10%. That's record low mortgage rates and short supply of homes that's sending house prices soaring, not just in the UK, but around the world. And shares with exposure to this hot housing market are having a great year. You see there, look, it dipped at the beginning of the pandemic 2020 and look, it's really going up now. So it's a good place to be investing. But there are concerns about the impact the real estate frenzy is going to have on longer-term financial stability. Now, house price inflation now stands in double digits in many developed economies, with the biggest increases seen not in city centres, but in suburbs and smaller cities and rural areas, which is quite interesting. You can see that, overall, though, the number of residential property sales, and I'm talking particularly in the United States and in the Netherlands, the sales fell, that's even as prices continues to rise, suggesting that demand is pretty much outstripping supply. Well, let's talk to Henry Pryor. He's a property buying agent. Good to see you. Thanks for coming on the programme. Let's start with the UK market. I mean, do you think it's peaked or might it get even hotter?
I don't suppose that the UK housing market could get much hotter. We've seen one of the country's biggest mortgage lenders announce and update us just yesterday that annual house price inflation, as far as they're concerned, is now at just under 14% per annum. So over the last 12 months since the introduction of the stamp duty, the buyer's tax that you referred to, was brought in July last year, we've seen some buyers saving as much as £15,000 sterling, but they've been paying to buy a property on average £25,000 sterling extra. That's what has surprised many people, and it is what some, including those in the government and the Bank of England, have been watching quite carefully.
So a saving of about $21,000, but actually the house prices themselves have gone up about $35,000 each. Look, considering the economic shock of the pandemic, you might have thought that prices would collapse. Why haven't they?
The housing market never likes uncertainty. Ordinarily, we would expect political changes, general elections, referenda, which in the UK, obviously, we've experienced just recently. These are all things that tend to ensure that buyers and sellers both sit on their hands and do nothing. So it's come as a great surprise to most people, myself included, that the housing market has actually seemed to thrive during the global pandemic. Coronavirus has been something that has reminded many people of their mortality, and as such has stimulated many of those people, if they're in a position to go out and to change the sort of housing that they are after. And as you observed in your introduction, many people now want space, they want flexibility, they don't want to see, but they don't want to be in a hermetically sealed flat with no outside space on the 15th floor of a glass tower. They want somewhere that they can homeschool their kids, where they can entertain their friends and family when they're allowed to do so, where they can work from home, a growing trend that we're seeing not just in the UK but around many parts of the world. These are things that have driven people's demand for new homes, and it's the cheap prices, cheap money, low interest rates that have enabled people to borrow more money and to be able to fulfill those dreams of new homes for their family by paying more money for those homes in the first place.
Well, you said it, borrowing it is quite cheap at the moment, but there is a shortage of affordable housing. Now, Ireland have got a scheme, haven't they, to control that to an extent, to put a lid on the amount of investors who pile in and snap those deals up. Do you think that's going to work, and should it be a blueprint for the UK?
Ireland has provided many clues to many housing markets around the world, continues to do so today. The gap between those who are able to afford new homes and who are driving house prices ever higher is widening between them and those who are unable to get onto the housing ladder to find homes either to buy or indeed to rent. And many housing markets around the world are struggling with this dilemma. They want to see a healthy housing market. They enjoy seeing high house prices or higher house prices, and politically that plays very well. Politicians find that the electorate is much more predictable and takes fewer risks when it comes to where they will place their votes every few years when a general election comes round. But we do have to look out for those who aren't as fortunate, and Ireland's lead, I'm sure, will be copied elsewhere. And in the UK, we've seen government stimulus, we've seen government packages come along to help those trying to get their first home and to clamber on to the housing ladder. Some have been controversial, some have led to higher house prices, ironically, in themselves. But it's something that's not unique to Europe, not unique to the United Kingdom.
And neither is the risks to commercial real estate. Henry Pryor, absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Juliet, thank you very much.
Thank you. The European Union has agreed to extend a grace period allowing for British meat products to be sold in Northern Ireland until the end of September. The ban would have come into place as an unintended consequence of the Northern Ireland Protocol, part of the post-Brexit agreement between the UK and the European Union. Let's talk now to our correspondent, Andrew Wilson. So, Andrew, the EU has postponed the ban. Isn't this, though, just kicking the can further down the road?
It is, absolutely, Robin, because nothing else has been changed and nothing else has been agreed. They originally allowed a 6-month grace period from January this year to give Northern Ireland supermarkets a chance to look elsewhere or rearrange their buying arrangements, because they would no longer be able to buy chilled meats like mince or sausages from the UK, because the UK is no longer part of the European bloc, the single market. And EU rules say that no country within the EU or within the single market can buy chilled meats from outside the bloc. So, of course, it reminds Northern Irish citizens of where they stand now. It's a reminder every day that they are no longer as close to the UK as they once were. And, of course, sausages, part of the great British breakfast. There's all this emotional tropes that get involved as well. But the problem is that they had 3 years to discuss this, and this was one of the many elements that came up in this arrangement of how do we deal with the problem of Northern Ireland. And one gets the impression that the UK negotiators thought, well, down the line perhaps we'll be able to sort something out. And clearly what Brussels is saying is, no, this is the deal you signed, this is the arrangement we made, and this is what you have to stick to. But we understand it's difficult, so here's 3 more months. But nothing else has changed, and it comes on the same day as a High Court judge in Belfast has just thrown out an application by senior unionist MPs who are challenging the entire withdrawal agreement within the Northern Ireland Protocol, saying it violates the Good Friday peace agreements of 1998, even violates the acts of the union. The unionists are doing all they can to disrupt the arrangement that has been agreed and signed off on at the beginning of this year. The High Court judge has thrown it out. No doubt the unionists will appeal again. But all these disturbing elements, the pressure that the unionists feel at being distanced from the UK by the Brexit arrangements, and the strength that the nationalists within Northern Ireland, the Catholic population, feel at being nudged that little bit closer to the island of Ireland, those pressures aren't being resolved, and nothing seems to be changing on the part of the negotiators to bring those two sides closer together.
And also, Andrew, in Westminster, the government set out plans for post-Brexit state subsidies, which it says will support the UK economy. So how's that being received?
Well, you'll remember that all the negotiations were haunted by this idea of Brussels and Westminster talking about the level playing field. This is what the level playing field is all about. It's the UK subsidy control bill, which is brought in to replace European Union subsidies for companies within the European Union. The UK now going it alone. First glance, they seem to be low on red tape and fairly agile and swift, giving Westminster a chance to bail out or help companies as and when it's needed. The CBI seems to be relatively positive about it at the moment, but of course there will be concerns that Edinburgh or Cardiff, the devolved governments, might say, well, we'll pay some money for this company and try and pull jobs around the UK and influence different companies as they grow or as they need investment. So there's plenty of road to go on this, but it is really the first substantial piece of legislation since Brexit was agreed at the beginning of the year to come into place. So it's cementing the divorce in an even more solid way than before.
Andrew Wilson, thank you.
Residents of the European Union who want to remain living in the UK only have until Wednesday to apply. Before Brexit, they could freely work, study and live in the UK, but now all that's changed.
And as Nicole Johnston reports, thousands of Europeans are finding they don't have the right paperwork to get their applications in on time.
Se I bambini non devono fare la domanda, perché mai hai riportato tutti questi documenti?
No, io me li ho portati per... Li ho portati per lui. Claudia Giacomato and her Italian family are under pressure.
I succeeded in apply in my pre-settled status. My husband didn't succeed.
So they have to apply again for her husband, even though Claudia's application for UK settled status was accepted. And now she's found out their children, Anna and Teo, also have to apply, but time is running out.
It's very stressful because, as you see, we have 2 kids, we have to apply for them.
Organisations like INSA are helping people who are struggling to prove they've lived and worked in the UK for at least 5 years. Dimitri Scarlato says often the government can't find people's records, especially for the elderly.
In most cases, lots of elderly people who have been here for 40, 50 years, they're not finding a system. And then when it becomes tricky, because then I need to prove that I've been here for the last 5 years. And first of all, they get anxious and annoyed because I've been living here for 40 years, why do I need to prove this? And then in some cases, it's difficult, especially for women, because there was tendency within, for example, the Italian community to have the bills all on the male names, on the husband's name. So then we need to be really creative to find also evidence for the women, elderly women.
With several million Europeans living in the UK, many have made certain neighbourhoods their home. This is the heart of the Portuguese community in South London.
More than 5 million EU citizens have applied to stay in the UK under its new post-Brexit rules. The deadline for it, though, is Wednesday. And the government has been hit with a flood of last-minute applications, up to 10,000 a day.
Our grandchildren.
The government says its system is slick and effective, and in certain cases people can apply for a 28-day extension of the deadline. The Giacomato family has meticulously kept all their proof of residency. Now they need photos of the children as well.
Why do you want to stay here in the UK?
Because my husband and me are very happy to stay here to give a special future to our kids.
Anna and Teo's parents left Naples in Italy 5 years ago to start a new life in the UK. Back then it was easy to move, but since Brexit they now have to apply to stay and hope it's accepted. Nicole Johnston, CGTN, London.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead on Global Business Europe, the beef with beef, the group which claims cows are the new coal and demanding action on agricultural emissions.
The EU's digital COVID certificate, which offers the promise of unlocking hassle-free travel around Europe this summer.
In less than 2 weeks' time, the Czech border will also open to all EU and Serbian citizens.
4.4 million Hungarians received their first dose of COVID vaccine.
18 and over can receive a COVID-19 vaccination, but it does come with conditions.
Third wave will probably take longer to emerge. This vaccination centre is part of a massive effort to try and drive down the numbers of the new variant that was first identified in India.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very busy when we try to save the world.
Awesome! We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU?
for trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. One of the biggest listings in years. Trading starts in the United States for China's ride-hailing giant Didi.
China is declared malaria-free after a 70-year fight to eradicate the disease.
And just hours to go before the deadline expires, the EU residents struggling to remain in the UK.
A dark warning, an emotive plea, but no concrete commitments to help save millions of people from starvation.
The World Food Programme has told the G20 development meeting that time is running out to prevent an unprecedented famine of biblical proportions.
Let's talk now to our correspondent Tony Waterman, who is at the summit in Italy. So, Tony, the World Food Programme, they're not mincing their words.
Not at all, Robin. This was a pretty dire warning. And when you put it into context, this being a chronic issue, it becomes even more bleak. At any given point in time, there are tens of millions of people who are on the brink of starvation globally. There are hundreds of millions of more people who are food insecure. They don't know where their next meal is going to be coming from. And the pandemic has really exacerbated this problem. And the World Food Programme saying that when you put it all together, there is a looming catastrophe. For hundreds of millions of people around the world, the COVID-19 pandemic has been less a fight for safety and more a fight for survival. Months of lockdown have left many out of work. Already meager wages replaced by nothing at all.
I can stay hungry, but my children cannot. I feel helpless. I break into tears. We don't get any help from anybody.
Grounded flights and closed borders have hampered humanitarian efforts. According to the World Bank, the pandemic has pushed nearly 100 million more people into poverty, an unprecedented increase. Close to 1 billion worldwide are now suffering from hunger and malnutrition. The problem is particularly acute in conflict zones, where humanitarian access is often intentionally disrupted. In the north of Ethiopia and the Tigray region, the UN says 1 million people are on the brink of famine. International aid agencies say they must be given access before a humanitarian catastrophe unfolds.
41 million people are knocking on famine's door as we speak. If we don't address their needs, over the next 6 to 9 months, you could have unprecedented famine of biblical proportions, destabilization of nations, and mass migration.
WFP chief David Beasley made an emotional plea for more financial support, saying billions are needed to bring food security to the world's most desperate communities. G20 ministers who have been meeting in southern Italy have vowed to redouble efforts to fight growing global hunger, especially in Africa, with promises of increased investment. But they offered few specifics on how exactly they plan to pull tens of millions of people back from the brink of starvation.
Clearly, one of the first steps to build a better world is to make sure everyone is fed. We have all reaffirmed our common commitment against food insecurity.
The group is targeting zero hunger by 2030, an already lofty ambition, now immeasurably complicated by an evolving and lingering pandemic. David Beasley also said that countries had done a good job in the early days of this pandemic, stepping in, ramping up their efforts to fight global hunger. But because this pandemic is lingering, because we have these different variants, it is not in our rearview mirror the way people thought it was going to be. And this is why he says that these leaders need to really step up their efforts. He says billions of dollars are needed now to avoid having to spend tens of billions of dollars in the future. We didn't see any major commitments statements from the ministers from this meeting here in southern Italy, but we have seen individual countries pledging money. The United States, for instance, $436 million to go towards humanitarian aid for Syrian refugees, and the EU also in recent weeks pledging another $5 billion to go towards the same cause.
Tony Waterman in Matera in Italy. Thank you.
Well, G20 leaders are also being urged to set clear emissions targets for agriculture. It's claimed the agriculture sector currently accounts for a third of all global emissions. A group of investors coordinated by the FAIR initiative, who claim that cows are the new coal, are calling for more transparency about targets. Well, let's talk to Maria Latini, the Executive Director of FAIR. Good to see you. Welcome to the programme. Thanks for joining us. Why are you calling on G20 countries to produce agriculture emission-busting targets?
Well, in the lead up to COP26, I mean, these G20 nations really need to be focusing on agriculture amongst their other climate targets, right? We've seen ambitious targets on energy and transport, but what is largely missing is agriculture. And agriculture, it makes up a huge portion of global greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, over 30% of total greenhouse gas emissions actually come from agriculture and animal agriculture. So we've seen targets to reduce emissions from the UK. They've stated reduction target of 78% by 2035 compared to 1990 levels. That's going to take a huge undertaking and a large amount of investment to transition to a low-carbon economy. So unless agriculture is also addressed, we're not going to make any of these targets a reality. So it's absolutely fundamental that we get some action on this really critical sector.
Not everyone will agree with your analysis of the figures. I think energy production, heating our homes and offices and transport, cars, flying, that kind of thing, accounts for 73% of global emissions, according to our World in Data. I wonder if cutting down on cows really can be the priority here.
It's absolutely necessary, and it's something that has been ongoing. I mean, methane contributes to a large portion of our emissions. In fact, just animal agriculture contributes more than the entire global transport sector. We're not going to stay within 1.5–2 degree targets without addressing agriculture. And in fact, it's just coming down the pipeline. Without addressing it now, certainly we're opening up this sector to bigger climate risks. And again, when we start talking about this issue, as you spoke about before, of food insecurity, a large number of problems stem from climate risks. And so we'd like to see governments actually focusing more on agriculture because we think it'll end up safeguarding livelihoods, economies, and the global food system in the future.
Well, I think we probably need to agree to disagree on the figures, but as you've probably been hearing, we've been reporting on the threat of what's been described as a biblical famine earlier in this programme. It's quite simply too much of the world has too much food and the rest of the world too little food. I guess if you're short of food, you might not be too worried about cows' emissions.
Well, I mean, we would say that the largest, most developed G20 countries need to be focusing on this. Certainly, when we think about moving into the COP, we need to be supporting those countries who have a significant portion of their GDP associated with agriculture. And in fact, in many of those governments and countries have livelihoods firmly interlinked with agriculture. But the writing, quite frankly, is on the wall. And we're not going to be able to stay within global targets unless we look at agriculture. So I think it's going to take a global concerted effort for governments to not only help incentivize farmers to look at some of those mitigating opportunities, but also think about ways we can produce food that actually produce lower emissions. So we would suggest that not only are there mitigating opportunities to reduce emissions in current agricultural practices, but there should also be incentives to move farmers perhaps away from some of the higher emitting proteins like meat or even pork into thinking about some of the more plant-based options that we're already producing already to feed those animals.
Maria Latini in London, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Delighted, thank you.
250 people have died after temperatures in the Canadian province of British Columbia soared to almost 50 degrees Celsius for a fourth day. Police in Vancouver say the deaths were mostly elderly people, all those with underlying health conditions. The heatwave has been caused by a dome of static high pressure. US President Joe Biden has joined scientists in blaming the climate crisis for the record high temperatures.
Rescue crews continue to comb through the ruins of the apartment block in Miami that collapsed last weekend. In an update a short time ago, the authorities confirmed the death toll had risen to 16, with 4 bodies recovered from the site overnight. 147 people are still missing. Emergency workers say few signs of life have been detected.
Cases of the Delta coronavirus variant are continuing to surge in Australia. The outback city of Alice Springs has become the 7th to enter lockdown, joining a list that includes Sydney and Brisbane. Only 5% of Australians are fully vaccinated, with many leaders calling for a faster vaccine rollout to help control the new variant.
DPRK leader Kim Jong-un has reprimanded party officials for failures in handling the pandemic. Kim said the neglect of duty by officials had caused a great crisis and put the safety of the country and people at risk. Pyongyang has enforced strict pandemic controls, including border closures. Officially, it has not confirmed any COVID-19 cases.
Rebel fighters in the Tigray region of Ethiopia say they're continuing to gain ground after recapturing the regional capital from government forces. Leaders from the Tigray People's Liberation Front have so far not said whether they plan to claim independence for the city of Mekelle, which has been a flashpoint for violence between opposing sides.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, we hear from the scientist in the Chinese space program who's known as the herdsman of satellites.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe.
And back to our coverage of the centenary of the Communist Party of China. China has been in celebratory mood. A host of events have been held, with cities putting on light shows. In Beijing, a major celebration will be held in Tiananmen Square. General Secretary Xi Jinping, who's also China's president, will address the event. CGTN will bring you live coverage throughout the celebrations.
When you think of the great American journalists of the 20th century, the name Helen Foster Snow probably doesn't come to mind. She was bold, courageous, and one of the few people to witness the founding of the communist movement in China. CGTN's Sean Caleb's reports.
Cedar City, Utah bills itself as an historic town. Here, at the entrance to the city park, stands a bronze statue, another important nod to history. One of the most important journalists of the 20th century that most Americans have simply never heard of, Helen Foster Snow.
I would say Helen is the best kept secret between U.S.-China relations.
Helen arrived in Shanghai in 1931 to work at the U.S. consulate as a secretary. It was a time Westerners were pampered and lived a high life while in China.
As she started seeing the suffering and noticed the political upheaval that was going on, she realized that she had a much bigger part to play, and she wanted to tell that story to the world. And that's when she met Edgar Snow.
A hardened, experienced international journalist, Edgar Snow wrote one of the definitive books chronicling the start and growth of China's communist movement, called Red Star Over China. It was a time of great upheaval as factions wrestled for control of China. Japanese invaders, the Kuomintang Nationalist Party, and the fledgling Communist Party under Mao Zedong. By now, Helen and Edgar were married and lived in Beijing. And in 1937, Helen cemented her place in history when she risked her life to travel from Beijing to Yan'an in Shanxi province to meet and interview Chinese Communist Party leaders such as Mao Zedong and Zhu De.
Helen Snow was one of the few eyewitnesses to the early period of the communist movement, one of the early Western observers.
Her stories were published in newspapers throughout the world under the pen name of Nim Wales. By now, the Fosters say, the Japanese wanted both Edgar and Helen assassinated, so they returned to the United States. Helen bringing a treasure trove of manuscripts, items, and nearly 11,000 photographs. In terms of history, just priceless. A young Mao next to Zhu De. And this rich collection was donated to Brigham Young University and is just now being preserved and chronicled. After returning home, Ellen and Edgar drifted apart, eventually divorcing. Living quietly in a small Connecticut town in the northeastern part of the U.S. until she died at the age of 89 in 1997. But ask the Fosters, who have grown to embrace and love China, considering the sour relations between Beijing and Washington. They believe the world needs another Helen Foster Snow.
I think I get emotional about this. Everything I thought I knew about China was false. And then when I went to China and met the people and their hospitality and their personality and just who they are, I realized they're just like me.
Adam Foster created a foundation to keep Helen's work and memory alive. He hopes when one day people ask, "Have you ever heard of Helen Foster Snow?" the answer will be, "What an amazing woman and an amazing story." Sean Caleb, CGTN, Salt Lake City, Utah.
Jean-Christophe von Fessen is a French academic, diplomat and former advisor to the Chinese government. He says it's a remarkable achievement to have lifted hundreds of millions of Chinese people out of poverty.
There are many, many achievements of the Chinese Communist Party over the last century, but I would like to underline one, which I feel is the most important achievement of the CPC in China, is to have succeeded total eradication of poverty. This is extremely important. 770 million Chinese people has been taken out of poverty since 1978, since the open door policy, and this is a real miracle. This has been succeeded because the Chinese Communist Party is a special party with a network going across the country to the lowest level of the units in the village. The party has always been a party of the people, the party of the Laobaixin, the people from the country, the workers and the farmers. And this is extremely important because from the start of the Chinese Communist Party, the ideal was to elevate its people, succeeding to have a well-off society and taking them out of their dire misery. And it is quite amazing that China succeeded 10 years before the United Nations centenary goal.
China's space program is one of the country's big success stories of recent years.
One of the scientists at China's biggest control center is called the herdsman of satellites. He told CGTN how even a 1-second delay when monitoring them could result in a major incident.
China launched its first Mars probe, Tianwen-1, in July 2020. It's here at China's largest satellites control center, where Li Hengnian and his colleagues are busy monitoring the probe and all other satellites and spacecraft on orbit.
There will always be someone on duty here working. The system is online 24 hours a day. A launch may only take 5 to 10 minutes, but a satellite's operation can be as long as over 10 years, like the Beidou satellites. During that period, this center keeps constant track of the satellites until they're brought out of service. Now you can imagine the intensity of our work.
Dedicating about 30 years to the field, Li's work can be found in many of China's major space missions, including the Beidou satellite's navigation system and manned spaceflight engineering projects. For the veteran scientist, it's been a journey with many challenges.
We had to make a choice, whether to develop the technology by ourselves or to buy it from others. Someone suggested the latter, but Li rejected that approach.
One thing I always insist on is self-reliance. I always think that the fundamental technology should be self-developed. If we rely on others, the development of the industry will face many difficulties.
Li first showed interest in astronomy at a young age. After graduating with a degree in computer science in 1992, he started working at this center and dedicated himself to the field of research.
The first generation of those working in my role used to work under very difficult conditions. They used to work in caves and on plateaus, so their spirit of hard work remains in my blood.
Li says the most terrifying moment in his career was when the satellites lost control in space. It took him 69 days to rescue it. But that was also the most exciting moment in his career. Li is now working on including AI technology in China's Mars exploration. The landing of the Mars probe marks another moment of progress in his contributions. He Weiwei, CGTN, Xi'an.
For more on the centenary of the founding of China's Communist Party and its efforts to tackle poverty, eradication and development, europe.cgtn.com, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and Weibo.
And our special coverage continues here on Thursday when China marks the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China.
Greek police have proudly displayed a Picasso painting that they've recovered almost a decade after it went missing from the country's National Gallery.
And just as the world's press snapped photographs of the famous artwork, that's worth millions by the way, it got away again as officers let the painting drop to the floor. Picasso's head of a woman, along with a painting by the Dutch painter Piet Mondrian, was stolen in 2012. Picasso personally donated this painting to Greece in 1949 to honour the country's resistance to the Nazis.
The headlines again. One of the biggest listings in years. Trading starts in the United States for China's ride-hailing giant Didi.
One of the headlines, China has declared malaria-free after a 70-year fight to eradicate the disease.
And just hours to go before the deadline expires, the EU residents struggling to remain in the UK.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps such as Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire, Android TV, YouTube and Daily Motion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. And from all the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.